Dorothy Wainwright had not planned on spending $6 at a county auction on a Saturday morning in October. She had not planned on being at the auction at all. She had planned, insofar as a 73-year-old woman living in a rented room above a hardware store in Clearfield, Kansas, plans anything beyond the immediate horizon of what needs to happen today, to spend that Saturday morning the way she spent most Saturday mornings, walking to the library on Elm Street before the heat of the day settled in, returning 3 books she had already read and selecting 3 more, and then sitting on the bench outside the post office with a coffee from the gas station, which cost $1.40 and was not good coffee, but was consistent, and consistency in her experience was more valuable than quality when the thing you were paying for was the ritual rather than the cup. She had not planned for the auction because she had not known about it until Harold Sims mentioned it on Thursday afternoon in the hardware store below her apartment, where she had gone to buy a replacement washer for the bathroom faucet that had been dripping since Tuesday, with the metronomic persistence of something that intended to continue dripping until someone addressed it. Harold Sims owned the hardware store. He was 68, widowed, quiet in the way of men who have spent decades selling practical things to practical people, and he had rented Dorothy the room above the store 7 months ago, when she had appeared at his counter with the particular expression of a woman who has recently been through something and is managing it with a composure that is costing her more than she is letting on. He had not asked questions beyond the practical ones. How long did she need the room? Could she manage the stairs? Did she need anything for the kitchen, such as it was? The room was small. It had been a storage space before Harold had cleared it out and put in a bed and a hot plate and a bathroom that functioned in all the ways a bathroom needed to function and in none of the ways a bathroom might aspire to beyond function. The rent was $200 a month, which was less than the room was worth in a town where rental options were limited, and which Harold had named with the straightforward manner of a man who was not interested in extracting the maximum from someone he could see was working with the minimum. Dorothy had taken the room. She had moved into it with a suitcase and 2 boxes and a framed photograph of Earl that she placed on the windowsill where it caught the morning light, and a Bible that had been her mother's, and a winter coat, and the particular understanding that this was where she was now, and that where she was now was not where she had expected to be at 73 years old. Where she had expected to be at 73 years old was the house on Prairiewood Lane, the house she and Earl had lived in for 38 years, the house where they had raised 3 children, where the kitchen still had the mark on the doorframe, where Earl had measured the kids every September before school started, where the back porch had the rocking chair that Earl had built the year he retired from the grain elevator. Not built well, he would have been the first to say, but built with the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided he was going to make a rocking chair and was not going to let the fact that he had never made one before stop him. The chair rocked unevenly. It had always rocked unevenly. Dorothy had loved it with the specific love you have for things that are imperfect and irreplaceable and made by someone who is no longer here to make them. Earl had died 2 years ago in March. A heart attack at 74, in the garden, on a Tuesday afternoon. While he was turning the soil for the spring planting, he did every year with the optimism of a man who believed that putting seeds in the ground was an act of faith worth performing annually regardless of what the season had done the year before. He had been turning the soil when it happened, and Dorothy had found him there, and the particular quality of that finding, the stillness of a man who had been in motion his entire life, was something she carried with her in the way you carry things that are too heavy to set down and too important to let go of. She had stayed in the house after Earl died. This was not a decision she had deliberated over. It was simply what she did. The house was where she lived. It was where the doorframe had the marks, and the porch had the chair, and the garden had the soil Earl had been turning when he left. She maintained it the way she had always maintained things, with the steady, unglamorous competence of a woman who had managed a household for 4 decades on a grain elevator operator's salary and had learned that maintenance was cheaper than repair and repair was cheaper than replacement, and that the secret to keeping anything going was attention paid consistently rather than dramatically. She painted what needed painting. She fixed what she could fix. She called the plumber when the situation exceeded her tools. She mowed the lawn herself with the push mower until the summer after Earl died, when her knee began to object to the mowing in a way that required her to hire the Dawson boy from 2 streets over, who charged $15 and did a reasonable job, and who she paid with a check and a glass of lemonade that she suspected was the actual reason he kept coming back. She was managing. She was 72 years old, and she was alone, and she was managing, and managing was what she intended to continue doing until the children arrived. They came on a Sunday in June, all three of them, which should have told her something because her three children had not all been in the same room since Earl's funeral, and before that, since Christmas 2 years prior, and the fact that they had coordinated their schedules to appear simultaneously on a Sunday afternoon in Clearfield, Kansas, was information she processed only in retrospect, when the meaning of the visit had become clear and the processing was no longer preventive but retrospective. Wayne was the oldest. He was 51, lived in Wichita, sold commercial real estate, and had developed over the years the particular confidence of a man who is accustomed to being the one in the room who understands what things are worth. He had his father's build and his mother's eyes and neither parent's patience. Karen was the middle child. She was 48, married to a man named Greg who sold dental equipment, and she lived in a suburb of Kansas City in a house that was larger than anything Dorothy and Earl had ever occupied, and that Karen mentioned with a frequency that suggested it was important to her that people knew about it. Mitchell was the youngest. He was 44, and of the three children, the one Dorothy privately understood most clearly and worried about most consistently. Mitchell had Earl's gentleness and Earl's tendency to let other people set the direction, and he had married a woman named Brenda who set the direction with the decisive authority of someone who had identified what she wanted and organized her household accordingly. Dorothy was not certain that what Brenda wanted and what Mitchell wanted were always the same thing, but she had learned decades ago that the interior arrangements of her children's marriages were not hers to rearrange. They sat in the living room. Dorothy made coffee and set out the cookies she kept in the tin on the counter, the butter cookies from the recipe her mother had used, which she made every 2 weeks out of habit, and because the making of them was a kind of conversation with her mother that she was not ready to stop having. Wayne began. He had prepared. She could see this in the way he arranged his words, the particular cadence of someone who has rehearsed a presentation and is now delivering it with the practiced ease that rehearsal provides. He talked about the house, about the maintenance costs, which he had researched, about the property taxes, which he had looked up, about the age of the roof, which he had apparently assessed during a visit she did not remember him making, about the reality, which he presented with the sympathetic firmness of someone delivering a professional assessment, that a woman of her age, living alone, in a house this size, with these maintenance requirements, was not in a sustainable position. Karen agreed. She agreed in the way that Karen agreed with things, by adding emotional texture to the practical framework Wayne had established. She talked about worry, about lying awake at night thinking about Mom alone in that house, about the stairs, about the furnace, about what would happen if something happened and no one was there. She said the word worry 4 times in 3 minutes, and each time she said it, Dorothy heard beneath it something that was not worry exactly, but was using worry's vocabulary. Mitchell was quiet. He sat in the chair by the window, the chair that had been Earl's reading chair, and he looked at his hands. Brenda was not present, but her opinions, Dorothy suspected, were in the room nonetheless. Wayne presented the proposal. He had printed documents. The house, he explained, had appreciated significantly since they had purchased it in 1986 for $22,000. The current market value, based on comparable sales, was in the range of $180,000. If they sold it now, in a market that was favorable, the proceeds could be divided in a way that provided for everyone. He said provided for everyone, with the emphasis on everyone. That was meant to include Dorothy, but that Dorothy heard, with the accurate ear of a woman who had been listening to her children's real meanings for 5 decades, as primarily including Wayne, Karen, and Mitchell. Dorothy asked what would happen to her. Wayne had an answer for this, too. Karen and Greg had a room. A nice room, a guest room, with its own bathroom, in the house in the suburb of Kansas City. Dorothy could stay there while she figured out her next step. It would be temporary. It would give her time to find a smaller place, an apartment, something manageable, something appropriate for a woman in her situation. Her situation. He said that with the careful neutrality of someone who knows the phrase contains a judgment but does not want the judgment to be audible. Karen nodded. She had the room ready, she said. She had been thinking about it. Dorothy looked at Mitchell. Mitchell looked at his hands. Mom, he said, and then stopped. The stopping was the thing Dorothy heard most clearly in the entire conversation. The word mom, followed by the stop, the silence where the rest of the sentence should have been, the sentence that might have been "this isn't right," or "you don't have to," or "I disagree." The sentence he did not say because Brenda's opinions were in the room, and Wayne's presentation had been thorough, and Karen's worry had been performed convincingly, and Mitchell had never in his life been the one to set a different direction. Dorothy sat with the coffee growing cold in her cup and the butter cookies untouched on the table, and the afternoon light coming through the window beside Earl's chair where Mitchell was sitting, and she felt the specific weight of a moment she had not anticipated and could not. She understood clearly. Prevent. She could have fought it. She could have said no. She could have told Wayne that his research into the roof and the taxes and the maintenance costs was not the same as understanding what the house meant, that the marks on the doorframe and the uneven rocking chair and the soil Earl had been turning were not reducible to a market value and a division of proceeds. She could have said these things and she would have been right, and it would not have mattered, because she could see in Wayne's preparation and Karen's rehearsed worry and Mitchell's silence that the decision had already been made before they arrived, and that what she was witnessing was not a discussion but a notification. The house sold in August for $174,000. Wayne handled the transaction with the professional efficiency he brought to his commercial real estate work, and the proceeds were divided in the manner he had outlined, which allocated to Dorothy a share that was, on paper, equal to her children's shares, and which in practice, after the fees and the adjustments and the calculations Wayne presented with the documentation of someone who expects his accounting to be accepted without review, amounted to just over $31,000. $31,000 for 38 years. For the doorframe marks, and the rocking chair, and the garden where Earl had died. For the kitchen where she had made butter cookies every 2 weeks for 4 decades. For the rose bushes she had planted the year Karen was born that had grown along the fence line and bloomed every June with a persistence that now belonged to someone else. Dorothy did not argue about the number. She had made a decision, the same kind of decision she made about most things, by identifying what she could control and directing her attention there. She could not control what her children had decided. She could control what she did next. What she did next was move into Karen's guest room in the suburb of Kansas City. The room was nice. This was accurate. It had good light, and its own bathroom, and a bed that was more comfortable than the one she and Earl had shared, which had been purchased in 1994 and had developed over the years the particular topography of a mattress that 2 people have slept in for a long time. The room was nice, and the house was large, and Karen was attentive in the first 2 weeks in the way that people are attentive when a new arrangement has not yet settled into routine. Then the routine settled. And what the routine revealed, gradually and then clearly, was that Dorothy was a guest in her daughter's house in the specific way that guests are temporary, and that temporary was not a duration but a status. She felt it in the kitchen, where Karen's system for organizing the cabinets was specific and not open to Dorothy's participation. She felt it in the living room, where Greg watched television in the evenings with the volume at a level that suggested the television was not for sharing. She felt it in the hallway outside the guest room at 10 p.m., when Karen would say good night with the particular inflection of someone who is also saying that the common areas of the house are now closed. She felt it most acutely on the morning she came downstairs to make butter cookies, the way she did every 2 weeks, and found Karen standing in the kitchen with the expression of someone who has discovered an unauthorized activity in progress. Karen said the oven was temperamental. Karen said the kitchen needed to be cleaned in a specific way after use. Karen said, with the tone of someone who has been thinking about this and has decided to say it, that it might be easier for everyone if Dorothy used the facilities during times when the kitchen was not otherwise occupied. Dorothy stopped making the butter cookies. She did not stop because Karen's request was unreasonable. She stopped because the stopping was the moment she understood clearly what the guest room was and what it was not, and what the room above Harold Sims's hardware store in Clearfield, Kansas, would be, which was small and plain and above a store that sold washers and sandpaper, and which would be hers in the only way that mattered, which was that no one would tell her when she could use the kitchen. She moved out on a Tuesday. Karen drove her to Clearfield, 3 hours, with the kind of quiet in the car that happens when 2 people are aware that something has ended and neither wants to be the one to name it. Karen helped her carry the suitcase and the 2 boxes up the stairs to the room above the hardware store. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room with the expression of someone who is performing a calculation about whether this reflects well or badly on her and is arriving at the answer she does not want. "Mom," Karen said. She did not finish the sentence. Dorothy placed the photograph of Earl on the windowsill. "It's fine," she said. And she meant it, not because the room was fine, but because the room was hers, and fine was a word that could be applied to things that were yours in a way that could not be applied to things that were not. Karen left. Dorothy sat on the bed in the room above the hardware store and looked at Earl's photograph in the morning light, and she thought about the house on Prairiewood Lane and the $31,000 and the butter cookies she had not made in 3 weeks, and the guest room with the good light, and the closed kitchen and the rocking chair that rocked unevenly that was now in Wayne's garage in Wichita, because Wayne had taken it as part of the division of the household contents. Not because he wanted it, but because it was there, and taking things that were there was what Wayne did. She thought about these things without self-pity, because self-pity was a direction she had decided early and permanently not to travel. She thought about them the way she thought about practical problems, as the current conditions from which the next step would be taken. She had $31,000. She had a room. She had the library on Elm Street and the coffee from the gas station and Harold Sims downstairs, who did not ask unnecessary questions and who charged $200 a month for a room that was worth more than that. She realized as she sat on the bed in the October light, the particular freedom of a woman from whom everything has been taken that can be taken, which is a terrible freedom, but freedom nonetheless, the freedom of having nothing left to lose. It was Harold who mentioned the auction. "County's selling off some parcels Saturday," he said on Thursday afternoon, handing her the replacement washer she had come in for. "Out by the old Whitfield road. Mostly scrub land and a couple of structures nobody wants." He said it the way he said most things, without embellishment, offering information the way he offered hardware, because it was available and might be useful. Dorothy almost did not go. Saturday morning, she woke early as she always did, because Earl had been a 5 a.m. man, and the habit of decades does not adjust to the absence of the person who established it. And she lay in the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the library and the coffee and the bench outside the post office, and the auction did not seem like it belonged in the sequence of her Saturday. But something shifted. She did not name it and would not have been able to if asked. It was the particular restlessness of a woman who has been sitting still long enough that the sitting still has become its own form of discomfort. She dressed and walked the 6 blocks to the county fairgrounds, where the auction was being held in the parking lot adjacent to the livestock building, which smelled faintly of animals even when no animals were present, the olfactory memory of decades of county fairs embedded in the concrete. There were perhaps 40 people, most of them men. Most of them the kind of men who attend county land auctions because they are looking for something specific, a parcel adjacent to something they already own, a structure they can repurpose, a deal that makes mathematical sense. They stood in clusters with coffee from the diner on Main Street and the posture of people who know what they are doing and have done it before. Dorothy stood at the edge of the crowd with her gas station coffee and the awareness that she was not one of these people and did not know what she was doing and had never attended a county auction before in her life. The auctioneer was a man named Dale Gentry, who had been conducting county auctions in Clearfield for 20 years with the particular rhythm and velocity of speech that auctioneers develop, a cadence that is simultaneously comprehensible and overwhelming, designed to create a sense of urgency that the items themselves may not warrant. He moved through the parcels efficiently. A half-acre lot on Route 9 went for $1,200. A derelict barn on the Morrison property went for $800. An equipment shed near the rail line went for $300 to a man who appeared to have been planning to buy it before he arrived and was simply waiting for the formality of the auction to confirm what he already knew. Then Dale Gentry said the words that Dorothy would remember for the rest of her life, not because the words themselves were remarkable, but because of what they set in motion. The way a single stone dropped into still water is not remarkable until you watch the circles it produces expanding outward across the entire surface. "Lot number 14, he said. "The old Hargrove grain silo on the Whitfield Road parcel. For 0.2 acres. Structure as is. County minimum bid is $5. A silence settled over the parking lot. Not the silence of interest, the silence of disinterest. The silence that happens when everyone present has already assessed something and concluded that it does not warrant their attention or their money. Dorothy looked at the auctioneer. She looked at the crowd. She looked at the paper in her hand, the auction list Harold had given her the previous day, and she found lot 14 and read the description. Old grain silo. Whitfield Road. For .2 acres. Sealed structure. No utilities. As is. She did not know why she raised her hand. She would think about this moment many times afterward, and she would never arrive at an explanation that satisfied her fully. It was not a calculated decision. She had not researched the property. She had not driven out to look at it. She had not done any of the things that a person who knows what they are doing at a county auction does before they raise their hand. She raised her hand because something in the description, something in the word sealed, something in the silence of the crowd that said this thing has no value, connected with something inside her that had been sitting still in a room above a hardware store for 7 months, and that was tired of sitting still. $6, she said. Her voice carried across the parking lot with a clarity that surprised her. Dale Gentry looked at her. The crowd looked at her. Several of the men in clusters turned with the particular expression of people who have heard something unexpected and are deciding how to categorize it. An elderly woman in a second-hand coat bidding $6 on a sealed grain silo that no one wanted. Someone laughed. It was not a cruel laugh exactly. It was the laugh of recognition, the laugh that says this is not how things work here, and the person doing this does not understand the rules. But it was a laugh, and it was aimed at her, and Dorothy heard it, and did not flinch because she had been laughed at before, in ways larger and smaller, and had learned that the sound of other people's amusement at your expense was only as heavy as you allowed it to be. Going once, Dale Gentry said, scanning the crowd with the professional attention of an auctioneer who is obligated to seek competing bids even when he does not expect them. Going twice. The parking lot was quiet. Sold, Dale Gentry said, for $6 to the lady in the back. Dorothy walked to the registration table and signed the paperwork with the deliberate hand of a woman who has just done something she does not fully understand and is committed to it nonetheless. She paid with exact change from her purse. $6. For 1s and 8/4. The woman at the table counted the coins with the expression of someone who has processed thousands of transactions and has never processed one quite like this. She handed Dorothy the deed. Dorothy folded it and put it in her purse beside the photograph of Earl she carried with her always, a small one, wallet-sized, taken at Karen's wedding in 2004. Earl in the suit he wore to weddings and funerals and nowhere else, smiling with the unguarded smile of a man watching his daughter marry someone and hoping it would go well. She walked back through the parking lot. A man she did not know, standing by a truck with a livestock trailer attached, said to the man beside him in a voice he did not bother to lower, $6 for that silo. She'll be lucky if it doesn't cost her $6,000 to have it torn down. Dorothy heard him. She kept walking. She did not know yet what she had bought. She did not know that the grain silo on the Whitfield Road parcel had been sealed since 1961. She did not know why it had been sealed. She did not know what was inside. She knew only that she had spent $6 on something that everyone else had decided was worthless, and that she had a deed in her purse beside Earl's photograph, and that for the first time in 7 months, she was not sitting still. She drove out to the Whitfield Road parcel the following morning. She had borrowed Harold's truck, which he had offered without being asked when she mentioned at the hardware store counter that she had bought something at the auction and needed to go look at it. He had not asked what she had bought. He had handed her the keys with the practical economy of a man who understands that a person who needs a truck and does not need a conversation about why. The drive from Clearfield took 14 minutes on roads that narrowed as they left town, the pavement giving way to gravel, and then to a dirt track that had been maintained by the county with the minimal attention the county gave to roads that led to places no one was going. The land on either side was Kansas in its honest form, flat and open and enormous under a sky that made everything beneath it feel temporary. Fields that had been harvested weeks ago, the stubble of the season's work still standing in rows that extended to the horizon. Fence lines that had been there long enough to have become part of the landscape rather than additions to it. The occasional tree, solitary, wind-shaped, standing in the middle of open ground with the particular endurance of a living thing that has decided this is where it belongs and intends to remain. She saw the silo before she reached the property. It rose from the flat ground the way silos do in Kansas, vertical and singular against the horizontal world, a structure that existed in contrast to everything around it. It was tall, taller than she had imagined from the auction description, which had said nothing about height because auction descriptions deal in acreage and condition and legal status, not in the visual fact of a thing standing in a field. She estimated 60 feet, which was a guess, but an educated one, because she had spent 38 years married to a man who worked at a grain elevator and who had talked about grain storage the way people talk about the thing they spend their days doing, with familiarity and specificity and the occasional detail that sticks in the mind of the person listening even when the person listening had not expected it to stick. The silo was concrete. This she noted as she pulled the truck onto the property and stopped where the dirt track ended and the grass began. Concrete rather than the corrugated metal of the more common grain bins she had seen her whole life across the Kansas landscape. Concrete silos were older, Earl had told her once, built to last in a way that the metal ones were not. Heavier, more expensive, more permanent. The kind of structure someone built when they intended it to be there for generations. The concrete had aged the way concrete ages in Kansas weather, the surface developing the gray-white patina of decades of wind and sun and rain and the freeze-thaw cycles that work at hard surfaces the way time works at everything, slowly and with results that accumulate. There were cracks. She could see them from where she stood beside the truck. Vertical lines that ran from the base upward, the kind of cracking that happens when a structure settles over decades and the ground beneath it shifts in ways that are too slow to see and too persistent to prevent. But the silo was standing. It was standing with the particular authority of something that had been built to stand and had done so through 60 years of Kansas weather and whatever else had happened around it while it remained. The door was at the base. She walked to it through grass that reached her waist, grass that had not been cut or managed in years, grass that had the quality of land that has been left to do what land does when no one is directing it. The door was steel, heavy gauge, industrial, the kind of door that was designed to seal against weather and vermin and the particular requirements of grain storage, which Earl had explained to her involved controlling moisture and temperature and airflow with the seriousness of someone managing a biological process, which, he had said, was exactly what grain storage was. The door was welded shut. She saw this when she reached it and ran her hand along the seam where the door met the frame. The weld was crude but comprehensive, a bead of metal that ran the entire perimeter of the door, sealing it closed with the permanence of someone who had intended this door not to be opened again. She stood looking at the welded door for a long time. She put her hand flat against the steel and felt the cold of it, the October morning temperature stored in the metal, and beneath the cold, nothing. No vibration, no sound, no indication of what was on the other side. Whatever was inside the silo had been inside since the weld was made, and the weld, based on its condition and the oxidation of the metal around it, had been made a very long time ago. She walked the perimeter of the silo. The base was approximately 30 feet in diameter. The concrete was continuous except for the door and a series of small ventilation ports near the top that had been sealed with the same welding technique as the door, metal plates placed over the openings and welded at the edges. Someone had sealed this silo completely. Not just closed it, sealed it with the deliberate thoroughness of someone who wanted nothing to get in and nothing to get out, and who had gone to the effort and expense of having it welded to ensure this. She completed the circuit and stood again at the door and looked up at the full height of the structure, 60 feet of concrete cylinder rising into the Kansas sky. And she thought about the man at the auction who had said she would be lucky if it did not cost her $6,000 to have it torn down. And she thought about the welded door, and she thought about what Earl would have said if he had been standing beside her, which is what she thought about in most situations that required an assessment she was not certain she could make alone. Earl would have said, in the practical, unhurried way he said things when he was thinking through a problem, that a structure someone welds shut is a structure someone wanted to keep closed, and that the question worth asking is not what is inside, but why someone decided it should stay inside. She drove back to Clearfield and returned Harold's truck and went up to her room and sat on the bed with the deed in her hands and the photograph of Earl on the windowsill and the October light coming through the window, and she made a decision. The decision was not dramatic. It was not the kind of decision that announces itself with clarity and certainty. It was the kind of decision that forms the way weather forms, gradually, from conditions that have been accumulating, until the moment arrives when the accumulation becomes a direction, and the direction becomes a step, and the step becomes the next thing you do. She was going to move out to the property. The room above the hardware store was $200 a month. The property on Whitfield Road was hers. The 4.2 acres had no utilities and no structure other than the silo. But the silo was a structure, and structures could be lived near if not in, and the $200 a month she was paying Harold was $200 a month she could be spending on the things that needed to happen next, whatever those things turned out to be. She told Harold on Monday. He listened the way he listened to everything, with the attentive quiet of a man who processes information before responding to it. He did not tell her it was a bad idea. He did not tell her it was a good idea. He said that he had a canvas wall tent in the back of the store that he had used for hunting and that had not been used in several years, and that she was welcome to take. He also said that he had a portable wood stove that fit inside the tent, and a cot that folded, and a cooler that kept things cold for 3 days if you started with good ice. She accepted all of it. She did not perform gratitude in the way that some people expected gratitude to be performed, with excessive thanks and the visible display of being moved. She accepted the tent and the stove and the cot and the cooler the way she accepted the washer for the faucet and the truck for the drive, as practical things offered by a practical man who understood that what she needed was equipment, not sentiment. Harold helped her set up the tent on the property the following Saturday. He drove the truck with the tent and the stove and the cot and the supplies she had assembled during the week, things purchased with the careful attention to cost that had governed her spending for her entire adult life. A cast-iron skillet from the thrift store, a set of enamel plates and cups she found at a yard sale for $2, a lantern that ran on batteries, a tarp for the ground beneath the tent. They set up the tent 50 feet from the silo, on a patch of ground that Harold assessed with the eye of someone who understands where water goes when it rains and has the sense to put a tent where the water is not going. He helped her level the ground and stake the tent and install the wood stove with the chimney pipe extending through the fire-safe port in the canvas roof. He showed her how to bank the stove at night so it would hold heat until morning, a technique he described with the specificity of someone who has spent cold nights in a tent and has opinions about the correct way to manage a fire. When they were finished, they stood in the late afternoon light and looked at the tent and the silo and the 4.2 acres of Kansas that were now, for better or for worse, Dorothy Wainwright's home. Harold said nothing for a while. Then he said, "You know, the old man who owned this place before the county took it, his name was Hargrove. Russell Hargrove. He died in '87. This property sat in probate for years because he had no family anyone could find. He looked at the silo. He sealed that silo himself. 1961. I was a teenager. I remember the talk about it. People thought he was crazy." Dorothy looked at Harold. "Why did he seal it?" "Nobody knows," Harold said. "He never said. After he sealed it, he never talked about it. Lived out here another 26 years, just him and the land, and that silo standing there closed. People stopped asking after a while. You stop asking about a thing when it's clear the person who knows isn't going to tell you." He paused. "County took the property for back taxes after he died. It's been sitting here since. Couple of people have looked at it over the years. Nobody wanted the headache of a sealed concrete silo on scrub land with no utilities. And the silo itself," Dorothy said. "Nobody ever tried to open it. Concrete's 2 feet thick," Harold said. "And the doors welded with industrial rod. You'd need a cutting torch and someone who knows what they're doing. And you'd need a reason, because opening something that somebody went to a lot of trouble to close is the kind of thing most people need a reason for." He got in the truck. "I'll check on you Tuesday," he said. He drove off down the dirt track, and the sound of the truck engine faded, and Dorothy stood beside the tent on her 4.2 acres in the enormous quiet of the Kansas evening, and she was alone with the silo. The first 2 weeks were an education in the specific practice of living outside with intention rather than desperation. Dorothy had not camped since she was a girl, when her father had taken her and her sister to the lake in the summers, and those memories were warm weather memories, the kind of camping that involves swimming and fireflies and sleeping bags that are more fun than necessity. This was different. This was October in Kansas, and October in Kansas is not warm weather camping. The mornings were cold. Not dangerously cold, not yet, but cold in the way that communicates clearly what is coming in November and December and the months beyond, and that asks the person experiencing it whether they are serious about being here when the cold stops being a communication and becomes a condition. Dorothy was serious. She established a routine because routine was how she had managed every phase of her life. And this phase was no different in its need for structure, even if it was different in almost every other way. She woke at 5 because she woke at 5. She built the fire in the wood stove and put the kettle on and made coffee in the enamel cup and drank it standing outside the tent watching the sunrise do what the sunrise does in Kansas, which is arrive across an unobstructed horizon with a breadth and a slowness that makes the watching of it feel like an event rather than a background occurrence. She ate simply. Oatmeal in the morning, a sandwich at midday, something cooked in the cast-iron skillet in the evening, whatever she had brought from town on her weekly supply trip, which she made on Wednesdays, walking the 3 miles to Clearfield and back with a backpack she had purchased at the thrift store for $4. She spent the days working on the property. This was the part that surprised her, not the work itself, which was familiar in kind if not in scale, but the satisfaction the work produced, which was larger and more specific than she had expected. She cleared the grass around the tent and the silo in a widening circle, working with a scythe Harold had lent her, and then with a push mower he delivered on Tuesday, as promised, when he came to check on her. She found, beneath the tall grass, the remains of what had once been a farmyard. A concrete pad where a building had stood, the footprint of fence posts marking what had been a garden or a small corral. A well, hand-dug, lined with stone, with a hand pump that was rusted but that Harold, on his Tuesday visit, assessed with the professional interest of a hardware store owner and declared salvageable with the right parts, which he happened to have. The well was the first significant discovery, significant because it meant water, and water meant that the property was not just land with a sealed silo on it, but land that could sustain the activities of a person living on it. Harold helped her restore the pump. It took 2 Saturdays and parts that Harold provided from his inventory, and for which he charged her wholesale, which she suspected was less than wholesale, but which she did not argue about because she had learned that Harold's generosity operated through the mechanism of fair pricing rather than free giving, and that to argue was to misunderstand the mechanism. The water, when it came, was clear and cold and tasted of iron and stone, and Dorothy drank it from the enamel cup and thought it was the best water she had ever tasted, which was the kind of thought that people have when they have earned something through effort rather than received it through convenience. It was during the clearing of the grass on the north side of the silo, in the 3rd week, that she found the first thing that did not fit. She was working along the base of the silo with the scythe, cutting the grass that had grown tight against the concrete, when the blade struck something that was not grass and not ground. She knelt and cleared the area with her hands and found a concrete pad, small, approximately 3 feet square, set flush with the ground and separate from the silo's foundation. It was a pour. She could see that, a deliberate pour of concrete made at a different time than the silo itself, the color and texture slightly different, the aggregate visible at the edges where weather had eroded the surface. It was also, she noticed as she cleared more of the grass around it, marked. There was a symbol pressed into the concrete while it had been wet, before it set. A circle with a line through it. She did not know what it meant. She ran her fingers over the impression, which had been made with something blunt, a stick or a finger, and which had survived the decades of weather because the grass had grown over it and protected it the way grass protects things, by covering them and holding them still. She stood and looked at the silo, and then at the concrete pad, and then at the silo again. The pad was 10 feet from the base of the silo, on the north side, opposite the welded door on the south side. It was not part of the silo's construction. It was something else, poured at a different time, for a purpose she did not understand. She thought about what Harold had said. Russell Hargrove had sealed the silo in 1961. He had lived here another 26 years. He had never talked about why he sealed it. People had stopped asking. But he had poured this pad. He had pressed this symbol into the wet concrete. He had done this deliberately, the way people do things when the doing has meaning they do not intend to explain. She covered the pad with a piece of the tarp she had cut for the purpose and weighed it down with stones. She did not know why she covered it. She would think about this later and decide that it was instinct, the instinct of a woman who has learned through a lifetime of experience that things of potential value should be protected before they are understood. That evening, she sat outside the tent in the folding chair Harold had given her, the the one she kept by the entrance for the evenings when the weather allowed sitting, and she looked at the silo in the last light of the day. The silo looked back at her with the impassive patience of a structure that has been standing for over 60 years and is not concerned about the passage of time. She thought about Russell Hargrove. She thought about a man who sealed a silo and never explained why. She thought about a concrete pad with a symbol pressed into it. She thought about the welded door and the 2 feet of concrete, and Harold saying you would need a cutting torch and someone who knows what they are doing. She thought about Earl. She thought about what Earl would say, which was what she always thought about when she was at the edge of something and could not see what was on the other side. Earl would say, in the way he said things when the answer was obvious but needed to be said aloud anyway, so the person hearing it could hear themselves agree. You didn't buy this place to look at the outside of it. She finished her coffee. She went inside the tent. She lay on the cot with the wood stove ticking as the fire settled and the Kansas night doing what the Kansas night does, which has become enormous and silent and full of stars that are visible in a way they are not visible from towns, even small towns, even towns as small as Clearfield. She made a decision. Tomorrow she would begin finding out how to open the silo. Not because she knew what was inside, not because she expected what was inside to be valuable, but because she had spent 7 months sitting still in a room above a hardware store, and before that, 3 months sitting still in a guest room where she was not allowed to use the kitchen, and before that, 38 years in a house that had been sold out from under her by children who had calculated its value and divided it without calculating what it had cost her to build the life inside it. She was done sitting still. She was 73 years old, and she had $6 invested in a sealed grain silo and a tent and a wood stove and a well that worked and a concrete pad with a symbol she did not understand. And she was going to find out what was on the other side of that welded door because it was hers, and because nobody else in the world cared what was inside it, and because the not caring of everyone else did not determine the worth of a thing. She had learned this. She had learned it at a county auction when she raised her hand, and the crowd was silent, and someone laughed. She had learned it in a guest room in Kansas City when her daughter told her the kitchen was closed. She had learned it at a kitchen table on Prairiewood Lane when her oldest son presented a spreadsheet that reduced 38 years to a number and divided it 3 ways. The things other people decide are worthless are sometimes the things that matter most. Dorothy Wainwright knew this. She was about to prove it. Harold knew a man. This was how things worked in Clearfield, and in towns like Clearfield, where the distance between a problem and a solution was usually one person who knew another person who had the right equipment and the willingness to use it. The man's name was Gene Pacheco. He was 61, a retired welder who had spent 30 years at the pipeline company in Salina before his back made the decision for him that he was finished with full-time work. He lived 12 miles east on a property that had a shop building larger than his house, which told you everything you needed to know about Gene Pacheco's priorities. Harold called him on a Wednesday. Gene came out on Friday with a cutting rig on a flatbed trailer and the unhurried manner of a man who has cut through a great many things in his life and does not need to be excited about cutting through one more. He walked to the silo door and looked at the weld. He ran his gloved hand along the bead the way Dorothy had run her bare hand along it weeks earlier, reading the metal with the literacy of someone for whom metal is a language. 1961, Harold told him. Gene nodded. He did not seem surprised by this information. The weld told him roughly the same thing, the rod type, the technique, the oxidation pattern, all of it consistent with work done in that era by someone who knew what they were doing. This wasn't a farmer with a hobby torch, Gene said. This was professional work. Somebody paid to have this sealed right. He looked at Dorothy. You want it open? She said yes. He asked if she knew what was inside. She said no. He looked at her for a moment with the assessing gaze of someone deciding whether the person in front of him understands what they are asking for. Then he nodded and began setting up the rig. The cutting took 2 hours. Gene worked with the methodical patience of a man who respects the material he is working against and does not rush the conversation between the torch and the metal. The flame was blue-white and precise, and the sound it made against the welded seam was the sound of something that had been closed for 63 years being asked to open. Dorothy stood 30 feet back, where Gene had told her to stand, and she watched. Harold stood beside her. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the torch was not already saying. The welds separated in sections, each one releasing a small breath of air that had been sealed inside since 1961, air that was 63 years old, air that carried a smell Dorothy could detect even from 30 feet away, dry and mineral and faintly sweet in the way that grain dust is sweet when it has been enclosed for a very long time. Jean finished the last section of the cut and stepped back and turned off the torch and lifted his helmet. The door was free. It hung in its frame, held now only by its own weight and the hinges that had not moved in 6 decades. He looked at Dorothy and gestured toward the door with the torch in his hand, a gesture that said, "This is yours now." Dorothy walked to the door. She put both hands on the steel, which was warm from the cutting, warm in a way that felt almost alive after the months of touching cold metal and wondering what was on the other side. She pulled. The door did not move. She pulled harder. The hinges protested with a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a groan, but something between the two. The sound of metal that has been still for 63 years being asked to remember how to move. Harold came forward and put his hands beside hers, and they pulled together. And Jean came forward and added his weight, and the three of them, a 73-year-old woman and a 68-year-old hardware store owner and a 61-year-old retired welder, pulled against 6 decades of rust and gravity and the particular stubbornness of things that have been closed for a long time and have settled into the closing. The door moved. It moved with a sound that Dorothy would remember as long as she lived, the deep iron groan of surrender, and then it swung open, not all the way, but enough for the light of the Kansas morning to enter a space it had not touched since Dwight Eisenhower was president, and for the three of them to see what was inside. The smell came first. Grain dust, old and dry and pervasive. The smell of a substance that had been sealed in concrete for 63 years and had spent those years slowly becoming something between what it had been and what it was now. Beneath the grain smell, something else. Something chemical. Something that did not belong in a grain silo. Dorothy stepped into the doorway. The light from outside penetrated perhaps 10 feet into the interior, and what it showed her in those 10 feet was the curved concrete wall of the silo's base. The floor, which was concrete and covered in a thin layer of the ancient grain dust, and against the wall, arranged with the deliberate order of someone who had placed them with care and intention, a row of wooden crates. Harold handed her the flashlight he had brought. She turned it on and directed the beam deeper into the silo, and the beam found more crates. They were stacked along the wall in a continuous line that followed the curve of the silo's interior. 2 crates high in most places, 3 in some. All of them wooden, all of them constructed with the heavy joinery of crates built for shipping or storage of things that mattered. She counted as the flashlight beam moved along the wall. She stopped counting at 40 because the beam had not yet completed the circuit and there were more. In the center of the silo floor, separate from the crates along the wall, was a table. A workbench. She corrected herself as the flashlight found it. A heavy wooden workbench with a surface that had been used, scarred with the marks of tools and work. On the workbench, arranged with the same deliberate order as the crates, were objects she could not immediately identify in the flashlight beam. Smaller items. She needed to be closer. She stepped inside. The air was still and dry and cold in the way that enclosed concrete spaces are cold, a cold that is not weather but temperature, the stored cold of thick walls that have not been warmed by sunlight in decades. Her footsteps on the concrete floor sounded different inside the silo than footsteps sounded anywhere else she had walked, a quality of echo that came from the cylindrical shape and the height. The sound going up and coming back down slightly changed, as if the silo were repeating what it heard in its own voice. She reached the workbench. She directed the flashlight down at the objects on its surface, and she saw what Russell Hargrove had left behind. Paintings. Small paintings on wooden panels, perhaps 30 of them, arranged in rows on the workbench surface with careful spacing between each one. The flashlight beam moved across them, and Dorothy saw colors that should not have survived 63 years in a sealed grain silo, but had, because the seal had been precisely what had preserved them. The controlled environment of dry, still, temperature-stable air doing for the paintings what climate-controlled museum storage would have done if anyone had thought to put them in a museum instead of a grain silo on the Whitfield Road in Clearfield, Kansas. The paintings were landscapes. Kansas landscapes. The flat open world she had been looking at her entire life, rendered in oil on wood with a skill and a specificity that she recognized immediately as something beyond ordinary. because she had spent 38 years looking at the same land, and she knew what it looked like when it was being seen accurately, and these paintings saw it accurately. The light was right. The scale of sky to land was right. The particular quality of distance that Kansas has, the way things far away remain visible in a way they do not remain visible in places with hills or trees or the interruptions of geography, was right. She picked up one of the panels. It was approximately 12 inches by 16 inches, the wood smooth on the back, the paint on the front applied with a confidence she could feel in the brushwork. It depicted a wheat field at sunset, or what she would have called sunset, but the painter had seen something in the light that was more specific than sunset, a particular moment in the transition when the gold of the wheat and the gold of the sky become the same gold, and the field and the sky are briefly indistinguishable. She had seen this moment. She had seen it every harvest season of her life. She had never seen anyone paint it. She set the panel down carefully and directed the flashlight at the crates along the wall. She went to the nearest one. The lid was nailed, but the nails had loosened over the decades, and she pried it open with her hands, the wood giving with the dry compliance of material that has been in stable conditions for a very long time. Inside the crate, wrapped in cloth that had yellowed but remained intact, were more paintings. Larger ones. Canvases stretched on wooden frames, stacked vertically with cloth between each one. She unwrapped the first one and held the flashlight to it, and saw a painting of a grain silo. This grain silo. This exact silo, painted from the outside, standing in a field of grass that was green and short and tended, with a farmhouse visible in the background that no longer existed, and a sky that was the particular blue that Kansas produces on days when the weather has decided to be simple. In the lower right corner of the painting, in a hand that was careful and small, was a signature. R. Hargrove, 1954. She put the painting down. She opened the next crate. More paintings. She opened the third. More. She began to understand the scale of what she was looking at. The crates contained the life's work of Russell Hargrove. Decades of painting, stored and sealed and preserved in the structure he had built for grain and repurposed for art. The art he had made in the years he had lived on this land. The art he had told no one about. The art he had sealed inside 2 feet of concrete and an industrial weld in 1961 and left for 63 years in the dry, still air of a silo that the county of Clearfield, Kansas, had sold for a minimum bid of $5 to a woman who was the only person in the room who raised her hand. She went back to the workbench. She looked at the smaller panels again with the flashlight, and she saw now what she had not seen in the first looking, that among the paintings there were other things. A leather journal, its cover darkened, with age but its binding intact. A tin box, rectangular, the size of a cigar box, closed but not locked. A folded piece of paper tucked beneath the journal. She opened the journal. The handwriting inside was the same careful hand that had signed the paintings. The entries were dated, beginning in 1947 and continuing to 1961. She read the first entry standing at the workbench with the flashlight in one hand and the journal in the other, and what Russell Hargrove had written in 1947 was this. He had studied painting in New York. He had gone there after the war, on the GI Bill, and had studied at a school whose name Dorothy did not recognize, but whose reputation, she would learn later, was significant. He had studied with teachers whose names appeared in the journal with the reverent familiarity of a student who understood that he was learning from people who mattered. He had returned to Kansas in 1949 because his father was dying and the land needed someone, and he had never gone back to New York. He had painted on the land for the next 12 years, painting Kansas the way he had been trained to paint, with the discipline and the eye and the technique of a man who had learned his craft from people who knew theirs. And in 1961, he had sealed the paintings in the silo because he had received a letter from a gallery in New York, a gallery that had seen a photograph of one of his paintings sent by a friend without Hargrove's permission, and the gallery had said they wanted to show his work, and the attention had frightened him in a way that the journal described with a clarity that made Dorothy's chest tighten. He had written that the paintings were the truest things he had ever made, and that the world, meaning the art world, meaning New York, meaning the mechanism of galleries and critics and buyers and the reduction of a life's work to a price, would make them untrue. He had sealed them to keep them true. He had sealed them for someone who would find them and understand that they were not products but records, records of what the land looked like when someone who loved it was paying close attention. Dorothy closed the journal. She stood in the silo that smelled of old grain and oil paint and the particular stillness of preserved time, and she wept. She wept the way she had not wept when the house was sold. She wept the way she had not wept when Karen closed the kitchen. She wept the way she had not wept in the room above the hardware store or at the auction or on any of the cold mornings in the tent when the wood stove had gone out and the Kansas dawn was asking her if she was serious. She wept because Russell Hargrove had sealed his life's work inside a grain silo to keep it true. And she understood this. She understood it in the part of herself that had been keeping things true her entire life. Keeping the house true. Keeping the cookies true. Keeping the doorframe marks and the rocking chair and the garden soil true. And she had lost all of it anyway. And now she was standing inside a sealed room with another person's truths preserved in oil paint on wood. And the understanding of what she was holding was too large to hold without releasing something. Jean and Harold were standing at the door of the silo when she came out. They had not entered. They had waited. This was, she understood later, a kindness so precise and so deliberate that it could only have come from people who understood that some discoveries must be made alone before they can be shared. She told them what she had found. She showed them. Harold looked at the paintings with the quiet attention of a man who is not an expert in art, but is an expert in recognizing when something has quality, because quality is quality whether it is in a washer or a painting or a person. Jean looked at the crates with the professional eye of someone who understands how things are built and stored and preserved, and who could see that whoever had packed these crates had done so with the care of someone who intended them to last. Patricia Allerton at the Kansas State University Art History Department drove out on a Tuesday, 8 days after the silo was opened. Harold had made the call. He knew someone who knew someone, which was how Harold operated, and Patricia Allerton arrived in a university vehicle with a graduate student and the focused energy of an academic who has been told something interesting and is reserving judgment until she has seen the evidence. She spent 4 hours in the silo. She examined the paintings with the systematic attention of someone for whom examination is a professional practice. She photographed them. She read the journal. She made notes in a small notebook with a pencil, not a pen, because pencils were what she used in the field, a habit she had maintained since graduate school. When she came out of the silo, she sat in the folding chair beside Dorothy's tent and drank the coffee Dorothy made on the camp stove, and she was quiet for a moment that Dorothy did not interrupt because she had learned that silence after examination usually preceded information worth waiting for. "These are significant," Patricia said. She said it with the measured tone of an academic who does not use the word significant casually. Russell Hargrove studied under Hans Hofmann and Robert Motherwell at the Art Students League in New York from 1946 to 1949. His name appears in the enrollment records, but he has no exhibition history and no known body of work. She paused. Until now. She explained what the paintings represented. A complete body of work by a trained mid-century artist who had been influenced by abstract expressionism, but had applied that training to representational landscapes of the American Midwest. The combination was unusual. The quality was high. The provenance was extraordinary. A sealed time capsule of 63 years with a journal documenting the artist's training, methods, and intentions. She said that a conservative estimate of the collection's value, and she stressed conservative, because the art market was unpredictable and the valuation of a previously unknown artist's complete works was complex, was in the range of $4 to $7 million. She said this while looking at the silo, not at Dorothy, which Dorothy appreciated because it gave her a moment to receive the number without being watched while she received it. Dorothy did not speak for a long time after Patricia said the number. She sat in the folding chair with the coffee in her hands, and she looked at the silo, at the concrete walls that had been standing for over 60 years, at the door that was now open, at the Kansas sky above it doing what the Kansas sky always does, being enormous and indifferent and beautiful. She thought about $6. She thought about $31,000 divided from a house that had taken 38 years to build into a home. She thought about Wayne's spreadsheet and Karen's kitchen and Mitchell's silence. She thought about Earl's rocking chair in Wayne's garage in Wichita. The news traveled the way news travels in small towns, which is to say it traveled completely and quickly, and with the particular efficiency of information that contains the elements people most want to share: an unlikely protagonist, an impossible discovery, a number with enough zeros to make the telling worthwhile. Harold did not tell anyone, but Patricia Allerton's visit had been observed by the neighbors on the adjacent property, and the university vehicle had been noted, and the length of the visit had been assessed, and the conclusions drawn from these observations were close enough to accurate that by the following week the story had reached the version of itself that would persist. The elderly woman who bid $6 on a grain silo and found a fortune in paintings sealed inside since 1961. Wayne called first. His call came on a Thursday evening, 9 days after Patricia's visit, and Dorothy answered because she answered the phone when her children called, even when she knew from the timing and the context what the call was about. He was careful. He had always been careful when he wanted something, arranging his words the way he arranged the clauses in a real estate contract, each one positioned to support the one that followed. He said he had heard about the property. He said he was concerned about her living situation. He said, with the particular emphasis of a son who is aware that his recent behavior is relevant to the current conversation, that he wanted to make sure she was taken care of. Dorothy listened. She listened the way she had listened to Earl's rocking chair creaking unevenly on the porch for 15 years, hearing what was there rather than what was meant to be there. When Wayne finished, she said, "I am taken care of, Wayne. I have a tent and a wood stove and a well and 4 acres and a silo full of paintings by a man who understood that some things need to be protected from the people who would reduce them to a price." The silence on the other end of the line lasted 6 seconds. She counted. Then Wayne said he would come visit. He said it with the tone of someone announcing a plan rather than asking permission. Dorothy said he was welcome to visit, that the property was on Whitfield Road, and he could find it by looking for the grain silo, which was the only structure standing in any direction for a considerable distance, and that she would have coffee ready if he called ahead, and that the road was dirt and his car would get dusty. Wayne did not visit. Karen called the following day. Karen's call was shorter and contained more of the emotional vocabulary that Karen employed when she was managing a situation she could feel moving beyond her control. She mentioned the guest room. She mentioned that it was still available. She mentioned, with the particular inflection of a woman revising history in real time, that the kitchen situation had been a misunderstanding and that, of course, Dorothy was welcome to bake whenever she wanted. Dorothy thanked her. She said the offer was kind. She said she had a kitchen now, and she gestured as she said it toward the camp stove beside the tent, which was not a kitchen by any definition Karen would recognize, but which was hers, and on which she had resumed making the butter cookies every 2 weeks, the recipe her mother had used, the conversation she was not willing to stop having. Mitchell called last. He called on a Sunday, which was the day Mitchell had always called when he had something to say that was not easy to say, because Sunday was the day he and Dorothy had always talked, during the years of the marriage, during the years after Earl died, during the quiet weekly calls that were the one thing Mitchell had maintained when everything else had been managed by Brenda and directed by Wayne and performed by Karen. He did not mention the paintings. He did not mention the money. He did not mention the house on Prairiewood Lane or the division of proceeds or the spreadsheet or the guest room. He said, "Mom, are you okay out there?" She heard in his voice the thing she had heard in the living room on that Sunday in June when he had said, "Mom," and then stopped. The sentence he had not finished. The sentence that might have changed everything if he had found the words for it. She said, "Mitchell, I am better than okay. I am standing in a field in Kansas next to a grain silo that a man sealed shut in 1961 because he loved what was inside it too much to let the world get at it, and I understand that, and I am fine." Mitchell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad would have liked this." "Yes," Dorothy said. "He would have." She stood in the field after the call ended, in the November light that was thin and gold, and arriving at the angle that November light arrives at in Kansas, low and long, making the shadows of things extend farther than the things themselves. She looked at the silo. The door was open. It would stay open. She had already decided that the paintings would be preserved properly, that Patricia Allerton would help her arrange their care and their exhibition, that they would be shown the way Russell Hargrove should have allowed them to be shown in 1961 but could not, because his fear of what the world would do to them was greater than his faith in what they were. Dorothy's faith was different. Her faith had been tested in the specific ways that life tests the faith of women who are 73 and alone and have been told by their children and by the county auction crowd and by the man with the livestock trailer that what they have is worthless. Her faith had survived the testing. It had survived it the way the silo had survived 60 years of Kansas weather, by being built solidly, and by standing still when everything around it suggested there was no reason to remain. She went inside the tent. She made coffee on the camp stove. She sat in the folding chair with Earl's photograph propped on the overturned crate she used as a side table, and she drank the coffee, and she looked at the silo in the last light, and she thought about Russell Hargrove, who had sealed his truest work inside concrete walls because he believed that was the only way to keep it safe. She thought about Earl, who had built a rocking chair that rocked unevenly because he had decided he was going to build one and had not let the fact that he had never done it before stop him. She thought about $6. She thought about 63 years. She thought about the particular courage of keeping something true in a world that preferred to reduce things to a number. The silo stood in the field. The door was open. The paintings were inside, waiting, the way they had been waiting since 1961, for someone who would see them not as a price, but as a record of what the land looked like when someone who loved it was paying attention. Dorothy Wainwright had paid attention her whole life. To a house, to a garden, to a recipe, to the marks on a doorframe, to the sound of an uneven rocking chair, to the particular way the Kansas light made wheat fields and sky become the same gold at sunset. She had been paying attention when no one else was, and what she had found, inside a grain silo that everyone else had laughed at, was proof that paying attention was never wasted, that the things sealed away do not lose their truth. That $6 in the right hands is not $6. It is a key. Thank you so much for staying until the very end. Stories like this one remind us that the most important doors have not been opened yet. If this moved you, there are more stories waiting for you on your screen right now. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. I do not want you to miss what is coming. See you in the next story.